Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Kilayim. We're up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Chet. The Mishnah now is going to provide examples of different types of forbidden grafts mentioned in the previous Mishnah. We're going to start with the prohibition of grafting vegetables to trees, trees to vegetables, and conclude with the examples of grafting vegetables to vegetables. Our Mishnah is following the opinion of the Tana Kama in the previous Mishnah, who prohibited grafting vegetables to trees and trees to vegetables, unlike Rabbi Yehuda, who permitted it. En notin yirakot betoch sadan shel shikma. We may not plant vegetables inside the stump of a sycamore. Now, Rabotai, if you look at the Mefarshim, the sycamore of the Mishnah is a member of the fig family. It produces long, thick branches that are used as wooden beams. At a certain point in its growth, the tree is cut down to a stump between 3 to 10 tefachim high. The trunk grows thicker as a result, and even more branches grow out of it. The stump is known as the stump of sycamore. Planting vegetables inside a sycamore stump is considered grafting a vegetable onto a tree, which is a sul. We may not plant vegetables inside the stump of a sycamore. We are not allowed to graft rue onto white cassia. Excuse me if I don't know how to pronounce the words in English properly. I've never seen these words. Now the Mefarshim explained to us that this rue is a herb with a strong smell. White cassia is a type of tree. Now, even the rue is not generally something that was worth keeping, nevertheless, it is included in the prohibition of grafting. Additionally, the Mefarshim tell us that the Mishnah teaches that Kida Levana is regarded as a tree. The Mishnah says, for these are examples of grafting vegetable onto a tree. We may not plant a branch of a fig tree inside a chatzuv in order to cool off the chatzuv. And the Mefarshim explained to us that the chatzuv is a plant in the onion family whose root grows straight down to the ground without branching. Yeshua actually used this plant to mark the boundaries of each tribe's portion in Eretz Yisrael. The fig branch cools down the chatzuv, which is very hot. Presumably it means that the branch weakens the sharp taste of the chatzuv. Now the chidush of the Mishnah is that even though a fig branch bonds weakly with the chatzuv and it is not inserted for the purpose of growing figs, but rather to reduce the sharpness of the chatzuv, nevertheless it is considered to be a graft and is asul. The Mishnah continues, En tochavin zmora shel gefen letoch avatiach. We're not allowed to insert the branch of a grapevine into a watermelon plant. Shetiyeh zoreket memea letocho, so that the melon should inject its water into it, because these are cases of grafting a tree onto a vegetable. And the Mefarshim explain that even though the branch receives the majority of its nutrients from the vine, to which it's still attached, and merely benefits a little bit from the watermelon's moisture, nevertheless inserting it into the watermelon plant is still considered Kilayim, because these are instances of grafting a tree onto a vegetable. The Mishnah concludes, En notnin zera delat letoch chalamit. We are not allowed to put gourd seed into a mallow plant. Shetiyeh mishamarto, so that the mallow will protect it. Because that is the case of grafting a vegetable onto a vegetable. And the Mefarshim explain that the mallow plant keeps the gourd seeds moist and protected until they can take root. Now, even though it was not done to improve the quality of the fruits that were produced, but only to benefit one of the plants in some other way, the Mishnah is still teaching us that this is considered grafting a vegetable to a vegetable, and that is asul. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Chet. Mishnah Tet now says, Atomen lefet utznonot tachat hagefen. If someone buries a bundle of turnips or bundles of radishes in the ground under a grapevine to store them. If you look at the Rav, the way he writes it, he says, we want them to be protected, guarded under the ground. Not in the way of planting. He's showing his intent. He doesn't want them to take root. For example, he buried a bundle of radish with a bundle of turnip together. The Mishnah says, the Mefarshim explained to us that generally turnips and radishes are typically tied in bundles once they are harvested and they're ready to be used. When somebody places them in the ground, tied, it's clear, obviously, like we said, you don't want them to take root. It's not considered planting. The Mishnah says, if some of the leaves of the turnips and the radishes were exposed, meaning the leaves of the turnip and the radish usually grow out the top of the bulb. The entire bulb can be buried in the ground while its leaves stick out above the ground. Now, the Mefarshim explained that the only reason we're speaking about the leaves sticking out is going to be we need it for the last law of the Mishnah. So again, if some of the leaves of the turnips and the radishes were exposed, you don't have to be concerned about violating the laws of Kilayim, even though you bury them next to a grapevine, because the Mefarshim explain, even though it is forbidden to plant turnips or radishes next to a grapevine, it is permitted to bury them there, since burying bundles for storage is not considered planting. Therefore, even if they did take root and grow, they do not become asur as kilayim of the grapevine, as the Rav tells us. V'lo mishum shvi'it. You don't have to be concerned of violating the laws of shvi'it, of planting during shvi'it. The Mefarshim obviously explain that shmita is when we say shvi'it, obviously mean during the shmita year. Shmita is the 7th year of the 7-year cycle, meaning shvi'it, more commonly known as shmita. During Shemitah, we know Torah tells us you're not allowed to plant in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Mishnah is teaching us that a farmer who buries bundles of turnips or radishes in the ground during Shemitah, he does not violate this issur. Why? Because when you bury these bulbs for storage, it's not considered planting. And by the same token, if the bulbs grow new leaves as a result of being buried in the ground, the new growth is not asur midrabanan from the rabbinic decree that prohibit grain or vegetables that grow on their own during the 7th year, as the Rab tells us, v'lo mishum ma'asrot. You don't have to worry about the obligation to give ma'asrot again when you pull them out of the ground. And the Mefarshim explain that if you have turnips and radishes that you already tied them, you already removed the ma'asrot, and now when they were in the ground, they grew new leaves while you were storing them in the ground, you don't have to separate ma'asrot from them again when you take them out of the ground. Only whatever was planted in the ground has to have ma'asrot removed. But these bulbs, like we said, are not considered planted. They were protected, they were guarded. V'nitanim b'Shabbat, they are allowed to be pulled out of the ground on Shabbat, because Mefarshim explained to us, since these bulbs, are not considered planted, a person is allowed to remove them from the ground on Shabbat. It's not the prohibited malachah of kutzer, of reaping. However, the Mefarshim tell us there is another problem of moving the earth that is on top of them, because the earth is muktzeh. Therefore, if some of their leaves are sticking up above the ground, they can be pulled out of the ground by their leaves without handling the earth directly. And this is the reason, actually, the Mishnah spoke about having leaves sticking out, because now, when you're going to move the muktzeh indirectly by pulling the leaves, it's tiltu min hatzad, moving muktzeh indirectly, and it is permitted when you're doing it for the sake of enabling a person to use them in a permitted fashion. Nevertheless, obviously the Mefarshim tell us you're only allowed to pull it out of the ground if it didn't take root yet, but once it took root, that is called detaching, kotzer, that is asur on Shabbat. The Mishnah is basically explaining to us, since you're burying them in bundles, it's clear that you don't mean for them to take root, therefore they're not considered planted for any of these laws. The Mishnah concludes by defining the prohibition of planting different types of seeds together. If somebody plants a grain of wheat and a grain of barley together, this is Kilayim. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eno Kilayim ad sheyesh shtei chitim usora. It is not Kilayim unless there are at least 2 grains of wheat and a grain of barley, or chita ushtei seorim, or a grain of wheat and 2 grains of barley, or chita usora vekusemet, or a grain of wheat, a grain of barley, and a grain of spelt. And the Mefarshim explained to us the logic behind the Tana Kama's view and Rabbi Yehuda's view. And the Rav explains to us that the pasuk that forbids Kilayim of the seed says like this: Sadecha lo tizra kilayim. You shall not plant your field kilayim. Rabbi Yehuda says that the term sadeh, field, is understood to be a place on which something is already growing. The kilayim prohibition requires a minimum of 3 seeds. 1 grain to make it, call it a field, and 2 other grains of 2 different kinds, like wheat and barley, to be the kilayim. However, the Tana Kama holds that even an empty plot of land can be considered a field. Therefore, kilayim It could be considered a field kilayim of seeds. Therefore, according to the Tanakama, require no more than 2 grains of different kinds, because again, he holds an empty plot of land can be considered a field already. Obviously, the halakha is like the Tanakama, the Rav says, then halakha Rabbi Yehuda, the halakha follows the Tanakama, that even if it's an empty plot of land and you planted a grain of wheat and a grain of barley together, that is still called kilayim. That is in of Mishna Yomi, Rabotai, Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.